None of the content on this or any episode of the Kratom Science Podcast, Kratom Science Journal Club, or on any page of KratomScience.com is intended, nor should it be considered, medical claims or medical advice. This is the Kratom Science Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for KratomScience.com, your source for all things Kratom. For episode 80, we have Jamie from New York, the host of the excellent new Kratom podcast called Everything Kratom. You can find that on Anchor FM or wherever you listen to podcasts. Link in the description. I was looking up, Googling like everyday Kratom, everyday because it's Everything Kratom, but I was like, this guy's a podcast on every day, so I'm gonna look up Everyday Kratom. But that's the cool thing about it is the formats for the three. You're one of the three main podcasts now. The other one is Kratom Guy Show with Mike Overstreet, and he does 3-hour podcasts once a month or something, and I do like an hour a week, and you do sometimes your conversations are 45 minutes an hour, and then you also do like little 15-minute ones, your thoughts on certain strains or blends is probably the better, more accurate term, and which is cool. Like, I want there to be more Kratom podcasts because it's still kind of like an insular, small community, and we really have to branch out before the prohibitionists kind of get a handle on this stuff. But yeah, so what made you want to start a Kratom podcast?
Well, I guess it could have been a few things, but I guess it was put on by the fact that there was this whole thing going on with the World Health Organization, and I didn't know any specifics other than I just saw some post on Reddit one day, and it was talking about how we need everybody to rally around Kratom and sign this petition. I was like, that's weird. Like that, I remember people doing that in 2016, but like there isn't anything happening again, right? So then I learned about the whole World Health Organization thing, and it just kind of like was this second calling, because when there was that emergency scheduling proposed, like 4 or 5 or 6 years ago now, that was like the first time when I really felt like I was a part of a Kratom community. And up until that point, I'd kind of just used Kratom and really enjoyed it, but I didn't really think of myself as part of like a community around it. And when that happened, I was like, wow, there's a Kratom community. And so this was like kind of like the second time that happened, but it more made me feel like not only do I feel like I'm part of a community, but like I want to have more contact with everyone, because I hadn't heard about this before I saw this post on Reddit. And if I hadn't been just checking Reddit that day, I wouldn't have known. So I don't know. I've always had a romanticized idea of like podcasting, but I didn't know if I could do it. I looked it up. I was like, I'm not going to do a podcast if there's existing podcasts, but like I would just love to do like an everyday short 5-10 minutes. What are my thoughts?
Yeah. And
then leave it at that. And when I looked it up, I saw Kratom Science and I saw the Kratom Guy, and neither one was like everyday short 5 minutes, 10 minutes thing. It was like a completely different thing. And I was like, all right, good. I won't be stepping on anyone's shoes by doing this, but it might be complimentary. And that was like what started my thought process about it.
I think all three of them are complimentary, and I think Mike actually even reached out to me, so I was like, yeah, I like this guy's content, and I saw it, and I listened to a couple months ago, and then I noticed it again, and I'm like, yeah, this is good stuff. I want to reach out to this guy. There should be more Kratom podcasts. There's not enough of them in my opinion. So, where are you from? I think is it New York?
Yeah, I'm from New York. Originally from Geneseo, New York. Is a small town just south of Rochester, New York.
Where do you live now?
I live on the border of New York and Vermont, around Granville.
Okay. Oh, yeah, the illegal state, Vermont.
Yeah, that's right.
That's pretty crazy. That's illegal there. That's kind of a curveball.
Yeah, and from what I've found out about it, I mean, like, I'm still part of, also, I guess, answering your last question a bit more, part of the reason why I started the podcast is so that, people could come along for the journey as I learn about Kratom, because I really, didn't know anything about it other than the types that I got seemed to work for my purposes, and that was it. But now I'm like, just because of the podcast, I'm learning about policy and, so much more. And so from what my limited knowledge is, it's classified in Vermont as like a synthetic cannabinoid, which it's not synthetic and it's not a cannabinoid.
Yeah, that's weird. In Tennessee, that's how they got it overturned, based on the fact that it was classified as a synthetic. So it's like technically wrong, and then that's how they got the law overturned. There were local activists in Tennessee, so maybe the same thing can happen in Vermont. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, that'd be great.
You remember 2016, I only started writing about Kratom in 2018 in the fall. So how long have you been using Kratom?
Well, I've been using it on and off again since 2011. That's when I was first introduced to it by a friend when I was first going to college. That was my first year of college. And my friend came up to me that day and said, "Hey, I got some interesting things in the mail. There's this thing called Blue Lotus, which is kind of like, a chamomile thing. And then there's Kratom." And he gave me a couple capsules of Kratom and said, "Oh, it, chills you out," something like that. Very general statement. And then, and I had, going into college, I had very, very mild Tourette's. I didn't have really any vocal tics, but I had physical tics with my head, and it was driving me crazy. I had anxiety about it. And here I am in college, like I'm going to be sitting in front of, 3 rows of students sometimes. I don't want to be like ticking my head all over the place. It's just a self-conscious thing. And so I took the Kratom, completely forgot I took it, had a great time, at a party that evening, but I didn't feel anything. And when I went to lay in bed that night before going to sleep, I realized I hadn't ticked once, like the whole day.
Wow.
And it's the first time I hadn't ticked for 5 years. Like I didn't notice. It was like it just wasn't a part of my life anymore, which is the goal of anybody who has that issue. So it was just amazing.
Yeah.
So I've been using it on and off ever since.
When you take breaks, do you tick again?
I don't tick that much. I do notice I do a little bit, but it's really fascinating. Like if I didn't have Kratom anymore, I think I would be all right. Like I think I would tick, but I feel like it's helped me gain control of it. And to do that, I just needed to be able to have some peace for at least a few minutes while I figure it out, if that makes sense. And now I've been able to kind of get a better read on my body.
So what do you do for work there?
I work for a national foundation, philanthropic foundation, gives money to a number of different nonprofits that do things from, it can range from helping educators run for office in New York City who want to see change in school policy, all the way down to paying, $300 for one school to rent a school bus to take kids on a field trip one day. So it's a pretty wide-ranging thing. But it's national work, so I work remotely in Vermont and New York.
It says Riverland Streams on your podcast. Is that maybe like your production company? Or
yeah, it's kind of like the pen name production company that I came up with a little while back.
Yeah, your podcast is different than mine. Mine's basically an interview podcast, and I've done a couple with just my own thoughts, and that was terrible. So, but I like it's funny. Like I want to start a podcast about everything I'm interested in, because I've been able to have conversations with scientists, people who consume Kratom, activists, journalists, just based on this one topic and surrounding topics. And it's funny that it's just you just have to have a podcast if you want to have deep conversations about that. I mean, I even had my own mom on the show to talk about SCACT, the stuff that she took when she had cancer that she thought helped her. You do a lot of maybe 10 or 15 minutes on different strains or blends, and then you've had some really good interviews. I really liked the one with Sean Zamorano from Philly Kratom, and it really put in perspective the Pennsylvania issue. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Or
Sure. Yeah. I mean, my main goal with the podcast was just doing, like 5-10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. Sometimes I get higher than that, but most of the time it's just meant to be a quick check-in so that every day when someone who uses Kratom wakes up, they have that like consistent connection if they want it. And that was my goal. So as long as there's something there, I think that, mission accomplished. But once in a while, I do end up having conversations with people. And sometimes it's me reaching out to someone. Sometimes they reach out to me. I think I've only had maybe 5 or 6 conversations. And most of the time, it's just me kind of rambling on and people have to suffer listening to me. But yeah, Sean Zamorano, that was really great. It was awesome talking to him. He is a Kratom advocate. He owns Philly Kratom, and he knows what's going on at the state level. But then, right after the episode, he got off and he was going to a local meeting in that town and talking about local ordinances dealing with Kratom near schools and churches and stuff. And he has a very well-rounded perspective on it. And I don't know, I really enjoyed that conversation because he was like, hey, I don't have a problem with part of the rules that they're even proposing. And I said that I'm going to say that at the meeting. And I just think that there needs to be some, rational thinking around this or this. So I really loved hearing his perspective on Pennsylvania.
Obviously, the Kratom-related deaths thing that the FDA came out with was really bad. But now there's some parents groups coming out that said my son died of Kratom. Usually, in one case, in that Pennsylvania case, the guy had a heart condition, I think, and he ended up having a seizure while he was driving. He was on an inordinate amount of Kratom, I think, and he was in a car accident, and unfortunately. So, what's your take on all that?
It's been a really interesting learning experience as I've been looking into it all, because I definitely don't have an agenda here. If I found out tomorrow that Kratom kills, I would be okay, Kratom kills. I'm not trying to prove anything,
Yeah.
But it's just very blatantly obvious that if you're trying to find Kratom deaths, just the act of trying means that there aren't many, by definition. And then on top of that, when you start combing through this data and everyone comes through it and they're like, okay, well, this person was shot 6 times also. And, this person also fell out of a window.
Yeah.
And this person was in a car crash. It's just, once, okay, twice, maybe coincidence. It's 20 times, okay. It's not the issue. And also, I think that it's interesting that I just saw this study last week. I think I did an episode on it. They're all blurring together now, but I think I did. And it was on the potential for respiratory depression when it comes to metrageny, the active alkaloid. And I'm a terrible scientist, but when it comes to reading through it, and it took me an hour to get through a couple pages, my basic understanding was that there's a ceiling. There's an actual ceiling, and that after a certain point, you can't, and that ceiling's very high. So, if you're taking 60, 80 grams of Kratom, at a time, which I don't, other than extracts, it's like eating a salad, you just physically, I don't know how people do it, but I think extracts is the one thing that I would, at this point, be comfortable in taking a very close look at and thinking, okay, we are finding, I don't know how many, the thing I would like to know, I guess, is how many of these deaths where Kratom is considered the cause, quote unquote, and where the amount of Kratom in them is enormously high, how many of those were they just taking shot after shot of extracts? In which case, even if there's a ceiling effect, taking that much of anything, that's just scary to me. So I don't know. I'd be comfortable with taking a look at extracts and how they play a role. But as far as Kratom's concerned, with all the evidence I've seen, it's just insane to think that it's the cause of any of this.
I'm not saying Kratom is as safe as water, but people have had water intoxication. And if you sat 2 guys down, one guy with a a truckload of coffee, and the other guy with a truckload of Kratom, and they started spooning into their mouths, the guy on the caffeine by LD50 tests would die a lot quicker than the guy that eaten all the Kratom. About twice as toxic pure caffeine, as pure mitragynine is. And but it's different. I'm not saying that kratom dependency is the same as coffee dependency. It's different. It's and because of the opioid factor, some people want to keep taking more and more and more, and then they get to the point where they think they can swallow a whole bag of it or down a 12-pack of extracts, and it's usually young men that they've tested for a lot of things. There might have been something in their system that they didn't test for. We've had recent cases of like phenibut adulteration with kratom in Colorado. Was real recent, and they don't always test for that on routine like toxicology reports. But there was one guy that I just FOIA'd the toxicology report for that had an inordinate amount of just mitratidine and none of the other common drugs at least. But if people were doing the same thing with coffee, they were grinding up coffee powder and just guzzling a pound of it with water. It's just not how you do it. There's definitely, I think there's like a learning curve. Would you agree with that has to be overcome?
Oh, sure, definitely. Yeah. And to the other part of your question about like people, families who lose somebody, mothers in particular, like my brother was an addict. He was an addict for 10 years. He was hooked on opioids, heroin in particular, but a number of different drugs. And it was really painful just to see him on and off going through this whole terrible cycle. And there were times when we were really afraid that he was gone. Like, we didn't know where he was. He didn't contact us. And we were like, oh my God, he's overdosed somewhere. And a few times he did overdose, but there was Narcan around. And it was like, if we had thought about it so much that I'm used to thinking that, where it's like, oh, if we had heard that he had died and he had this weird drug in his system that we'd never heard of before, I would want to know what the heck that thing was and why it killed my brother. Like, in addition to the other things, I can imagine thinking that way. So I never blame them for thinking that way. And I have a lot of sympathy for it being close to that situation. But if I found, and my brother is gone now, but if we had found him and he had like 12 different drugs in his system and then kratom, I don't think I'd be focusing on that one thing. I'd be like, okay, 12 different drugs killed him and this other thing did too, I guess. But like, I don't understand the focus on it. That's what I don't get. I don't get why there's this focus on the kratom when there's cocaine, fentanyl, and like 3 other things. Why is the kratom the thing? Is it just because they don't know what it is? I don't know.
Oh man, I'm sorry to hear that. If you don't mind my asking, I'll cut it out.
No.
But it wasn't an overdose that
no, it wasn't. It's fine for asking. But thanks. He was on and off dealing with addiction, and then he finally was in prison for a couple of years and got clean while he was there, and the whole time he wanted to get off of the drugs, and so he was very happy to be clean. He got out of prison in 2019 or 2018. Ended up going up to Alaska and becoming a kayak guide. And so in 2019, 2020, he was a kayak guide and loved the job, was physical and everything, and was clean. And then the pandemic hit and most people stopped working, and he kept working because the place needed workers and he was willing to do it. But he was overworked, and it was also getting dark up there and long winters, and he started having bad feelings again about, doing drugs again. And so he ended up starting to do them again. And then in January this past year, January 2021, he went missing, and we ended up finding out that he had taken his own life because he just couldn't handle it anymore. So it was a very sad ending to this story when we really thought that he had made it through. So it's a difficult thing, but well, how do you end that sentence? It's a difficult thing.
Yeah, that's it. I lost a sibling too to cancer. It'll be 20 years now, but I'm sorry to hear that, man. I lost a really close friend to suicide when I was 18, 19. But thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
So, you talk a lot about strains. Do you have preferred strains or blends? I hope we get to a point where the lab infrastructure set up, because it's not quite there yet, that we could have relatively cheap testing and we could all know what alkaloids are in there, and then we could have research to tell us what the alkaloids or combination of alkaloids do. One might be speedy, one might be opioid. You have a lot of episodes on green Malay, this, that. What kind of strains do you prefer, and do you use different ones, and do you find that they're kind of consistent vendors, or are they not?
That's a good question. Well, yes. So I definitely have some preferred ones, and it's somewhat shifted since I started doing the podcast. I love doing this podcast because it changes my view of Kratom all the time, and it causes me to be, I don't know, more active about how I'm experiencing it. So I'm thinking about it more. So it's good for me, I think. I think that one constant throughout the whole time is that I've definitely really enjoyed white Indo, and that one is probably my go-to every day. And I usually, I don't take Kratom every day, but it's a pretty useful tool I use quite often, at least a few times a week. I'll take it, maybe like around 1 o'clock when I'm midway through work and I still have a lot to do, and it's like starting on the second half of the day, it's like a huge boost of energy for me, and it just syncs really well with my body. And then but also, so I was really into whites when I started the podcast, but I kind of discovered the power of greens while I've been doing it. So now I'm all about green Mang Da in the morning. It starts off my day with just this nice, smooth building energy. And it's like white Indo is a punch of energy for me, but green Mang Da like builds over time. And that's exactly what I need in the morning, rather than having like a punch of energy and then like, oh, I'll do it again in 2 hours, maybe, or 3. So I've been learning a schedule that works for me. I also really like white Thai and green Thai. I think I like white Thai better. I do like red Thai though. I'm not about the reds too much, but I love red Thai. And from there, it's just kind of anyone's guess. I mean, I've been trying new things. I really like white Borneo, which I never had tried before, like a month or 2 ago. I mean, it's a whole new world. I love it.
Do you find, like, though, that these brands of white Thai, Mangda, are consistent with different vendors? Because I think vendors try to name them. It's all, for one thing, it's all slang. It's not botanically different strains, and people like to bring that up to show how smart they are or whatever. But but it's we know strain is slang term. But the thing is, when people go on Google, they look up Kratom strains, and they come. That's why vendors use the term strains. Hopefully we could evolve out of that and say blends or whatever. But do you find like some of the, like a Mangda might be the same from one vendor to the other, a red or a green or a white might be kind of consistent?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I forgot that was the second part of your question. That's something that I've been starting to really pay attention to. When I started the podcast, I think the first 3 episodes I did was like, white strains, green strains, and red strains that I like or don't like or whatever. And someone sent me a message like, I only had 5 listeners, at that point, and like one of the 5 sent me a message and was like, "You're wrong." It's like, you don't use
there
the
aren't
word
really
strains.
They were
like, use the word variety. And I was like, okay. So I've been saying varieties ever since. Yeah. And I think it's good. But so I think that I have found that, like, if I were to be given Kratom, without knowing what it is and asked to identify it, I might be able to. But it would have to, like, if I was given white Indo, I would know, just because I've had white Indo and I've had it from a few different sources, and that one more or less I have found has been similar. But when it comes to Mang Da, it's like the biggest up in the air I've ever seen. Like, I've never had one consistent Mang Da product in my life. and that's definitely true for most of the others, but one or two I think that I have found has been similar. I was looking into like gold Kratom the other day, and I did an episode on that, and like was just looking up gold kratom as I was doing the episode, which usually I do my research before, but I kind of wanted to do like a interactive, hey, while you're listening to this podcast, I'm going to be looking this up and see what we find. And it was like one website said gold is red kratom that is dried this way, and then it's blended with green. And then someone else was like, no, it's not that. Although a lot of people will say this, it's that. And there's like 3 different conflicting websites. And then the last website was great because it was like, what's gold kratom? I don't know. Nobody knows. It's whatever people make it to be. It's just green and red.
It really
whatever
is.
From there's good.
Yeah. There aren't really different plants. There's Rifat. This guy, Claude Rifat, developed probably what is a different strain than might be in Thailand or Indonesia, but I think it's really the drying process, right? I mean, is that what you've ascertained? Because I don't know if there are like red stem, green stem, white stem on different trees.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea. That's the elephant in the room for me, and like I'm always trying to be transparent about the fact that I really don't know. From what I've read, it's the only thing that I've found that I think is really interesting when it comes to differentiating how kratom's going to act on you is the idea of fermenting leaves. That's really interesting to me because that is the difference between green and black and oolong tea. It's like a fermentation process. And it's like, okay, that I can identify with, and I can like put a face to the name with that. So I can imagine that having to do something with how it's going to be and how it's going to act. But like, yeah, all I know is that it has something to do with drying. I've seen people say kratom leaves, they all have this type of, stem unless you do this to it. I'm like, oh. So I don't know.
And the way we're talking now, like, I don't know, maybe it does this, that. This is how the scientists, this is about where they're at, because they really don't know either. They're getting to it. I mean, I know I had Dr. McCurdy on and Dr. Brian Pearson, who's a horticulturalist. They are in the beginning stages of just growing their own plants, picking them at different times, testing the alkaloids here and there, and it's like a full mass spectrometry type of test that they're doing. And in the Philippines, they found like no mitragynine in their leaves, but people still use it and get effects from it. Soren from Top Tree is in West Virginia, and he brought me up a kratom plant that I have growing under a grow light in my basement, and they harvested all their leaves. He brought me a bunch of huge fresh leaves from one of their plants, and it had an effect. Chewing it, making a fresh leaf tea out of it, had a total effect. And he was like, they were like way low in mitragynine. They had like speciosiliatine or something. It was high in that. And I'm like, well, that's weird, because it had a total effect. I even like put 5 leaves in a tea once, and I was like, whoa, that was a little too much, Actually, it was actually good. I was just like shocked by how much of an effect it had, and then he told me that they were like all super low mitragynine, and I was like, all right, well, that's weird. I think we do know, and I talked to Dr. McCurdy about this, is 7-hydroxy is the molecule or compound that is actually stronger than morphine if it were to be isolated. Luckily, it's not cost effective to extract that. It would cost more than it would be worth. Luckily, because then some of these shady vendors will be sprinkling it all over their product. I mean, they say abuse potential. I think that's an outdated word, but they use it in pharmacology. I think they should call it dependency potential, because you can get dependent on it quicker. It not only happens in the metabolism, but it happens in the drying of the leaf, because you're adding oxygen, hydroxy, 7-hydroxy mitragynine versus mitragynine. Did you ever think about that? Like, I guess in with fresh leaf versus dried leaf over here, where people might be developing more severe dependency issues. I mean, do you think that's the case? Because in the old country where it's from, in Southeast Asia, they say there's never been deaths. Maybe old men are dependent on it, but it doesn't seem like a big deal.
Yeah, I have thought about that a lot. I've wondered, I'm sure people make this comparison in their heads if they think about it, but it just reminds me of, cocaine coming from cocoa leaves. It's like the exact same thing. You got people chewing on the leaves, doing really tough, arduous work, really high elevation. And it's not like you hear about a bunch of cocaine addicts in Peru, but then you bring it up here as a concentrated powder and looking very different than how it looks on a tree. And you've got a bunch of issues in the 80s. So It's like, I feel like it can be a very, very broad general connection there, with kratom. Like, I've always wondered, I know I'm not actually getting the straight up leaf. What has this thing gone through to get to me? And how is this different from just picking the thing off of the tree and just munching on it, So I have thought about that a lot. And I know that, again, it kind of goes back to the extracts thing. And I looked at the 8-factor analysis that the AKA put out last year, the updated 8-factor analysis. And one of the few things I found in that where it was like talking about kratom in a negative light with the LD50 with mice and everything was that they found a lot more evidence of addiction and respiratory depression when 7-hydroxymetragynine was concentrated versus metragynine. They found remote, like hardly anything, if anything at all. But 7 was and then from there on, I learned, that's probably why all these Kratom Consumer Protection Acts are limiting 7-hydroxymetragynine at 2% or less.
It's a good law, too. I think if that was extracted, there would be a much bigger problem. It seems like metragynine at University of Florida, they're developing they want to develop it into a pain relieving and also opioid dependence treating drug. Dr. Abhishek Sharma, when I interviewed him, he said it's like 4 opioid withdrawal treating drugs in one because it hits so many receptors, just the metragynine compound. Dr. McCurdy told me is like the alkaloids acting in concert are completely different than, because they've done studies with lyophilized kratom tea where they basically make kratom tea. They make the purest kratom tea with all the alkaloids, so they're not taking out any alkaloids, but I think they're like freeze drying it, grinding it, and like making it into a tea. There's a process, and we talked about it on our Journal Club segment of the podcast. He's saying, it's like a symphony orchestra. If you have just one violin playing, then it'll sound different than the orchestra together, which is how the alkaloids work. It's the same thing. And he said 7-hydroxy, you might, if you just amplify that one thing and it's the only thing playing, it might even be up there with fentanyl in terms of opioid. And I'm not clear whether it's a full or partial agonist on the opioid receptors. I'm not clear whether you were talking about respiratory depression before. I'm not clear whether it, how much of it causes that, but you said there is a ceiling for kratom, right?
Well, I mean, again, I'm clarifying. I don't know for sure, but the most recent studies that I did read through the other day, from what I could tell, it was very scientific language, so I just had trouble getting through it. But from what I could tell, they were saying that you take kratom, enzymes act on it, and the respiratory depression there can be a ceiling for it because it's like it's limited on the amount that the enzymes can act on it. Like if there are no more, if the enzymes are limited, then that's how much you can have. And then on top of that, 7-hydroxymetragynine, it shows a more of a potential for having a respiratory depressant effect. That's what the 8-factor analysis was showing. It wasn't an extremely high thing. You still have to take a whole ton of it, but it showed any evidence whatsoever versus metragynine. It showed hardly any.
How do you take kratom? Do you do capsules or toss and wash, mix it with juice?
Yeah, most people think I'm insane. I just toss it and wash it, or I do it in a tea. Like I don't know.
I like tea.
Capsules I do for traveling, but yeah.
Okay, like when you travel, do you always bring kratom, and do you have any problem with that? A lot of people think you'd have a problem with that, but my best friend works for TSA, and he said, we're looking for bombs. We don't care.
I do worry about it sometimes, like when I travel with it. Not as much anymore. I've traveled with it a few times in different settings now where I'm comfortable doing it more or less. Trains, no problem. Buses, no problem. Obviously. And then when it gets to, flying, okay. Is it within the country? Yes. I'm not really worried about it, but I'm not going to bring powder anymore. I have traveled with just a bag of kratom powder. I make sure that I don't open it beforehand. Like I want it to just be a sealed product. Yeah. For some reason that makes me feel better. but I don't want like green powder everywhere. I don't want it opened previously. But with capsules, I think about it. I'm like, you go through a metal detector and they're like, okay, that could be like, turmeric in a capsule or it could be anything, and they're not going to check, and they never have. I actually have, so I don't worry about it within the country, but I have traveled outside of the country once with kratom. I flew to Scotland. I brought powder, and they did not care. So, that's cool. So I haven't had any issues with it, but I still am very cautious.
Do you have a tolerance to kratom, and have you ever had to take tolerance breaks or got to that level?
I've been surprisingly lucky when it comes to that. I have developed a tolerance to it here and there, but overall, even if I take the same type of kratom every single day for a week, I'm really not going to need like a higher dosage. Maybe I would, but I take such a small amount to begin with. I really don't need much. I read so much and hear so much from people saying I take 6 grams or I take like 4 grams or something. And like for me, like 3 grams is my limit. Like I need between 1.5 and 3 grams is my perfect like sweet spot. And then after that, it's just kind of unnecessary for me. So I don't really like take that much compared to a lot of other people. I know everybody's body is different. So I don't like think that like, oh, I take the right amount. Like I think that everybody's body's processing it differently, but I do, I don't find myself needing to increase my dosage hardly ever. I think it's happened maybe a couple times, like for 1 or 2 white varieties, but I've overall, it'd be like, oh, I feel like I need an extra 0.5 gram or a gram. It's just not anything that bothers me.
That's the same thing with me. I've never developed a tolerance. It's just there in next to our coffee and tea, and my wife takes it. I mean, she had side effects from her COVID vaccines, and she took it, and it helped her get up to work. And she does that. If she's groggy, she'll take some kratom. I don't do it when I drink, which there's periods where I drink, and then I go off drinking for like 6 weeks, and I'll take kratom like 4 or 5 days a week, and it helps me with whatever mental thing that makes me drink, which is mainly anxiety, I guess, in general. But kratom gives me like a feeling of well-being that I would get usually with alcohol. But are you open about your kratom use with like your friends, family, coworkers?
Yeah, well, coworkers, yes, but with the caveat that like I've told them about it once and they think it's interesting, but it's like I don't like keep bringing it up, not because I'm worried, but as much as like I don't feel like this is a necessary topic, because I don't want to. It's and this could go a whole nother way in terms of our conversation, but it's just interesting how for some reason people they can't understand kratom when you explain it to them, and they always got to know more or don't quite grasp it all unless they're actually like a part of this community and really like taking it. And so it's just because it's like a complex thing to explain. And the second you bring up it acts on the opioid receptor, it's a partial, agonist or whatever the word is. It's like you lose them, because they're like, oh, opioid. And so I don't really bring it up with people like that often, but with friends, totally open about it. And that's because I have more time to explain to them, what it is. And I feel like, over the course of the time that I see them, or I'll see them a few times, I can bring it up again, or they bring it up again. And I'm like, well, actually this. Whereas if I'm in like a work setting, it's like, it's not going to come up often enough where I can get across what this thing is. So I'm just not going to bother. My family does know that I use it, and they they're glad that it works for me, and glad that I also don't rely only on kratom. When I was right before college, I would use I was using a few different pharmaceuticals that I was prescribed for my Tourette tics, and then for anxiety, and it really just wasn't right for me. Making yourself a chemistry experiment is scary, and I really didn't like it, and it had some poor effects on me. So my parents were really glad when they saw that this natural leaf that I just have to take just a very small amount of it, and then my head doesn't move against my will anymore. What is this?
The whole thing about it, it's a legal substance. If you're going from one state to another, you shouldn't have to hide it. It's kind of like there's a shame still attached to kratom, because it does cause dependency, and it does feel really great. But what do you think about all that with the shame of it? It's a legal substance. It's not harming most of us, the vast majority of us who take it.
Well, I totally agree, and I haven't told my primary care doctor about it. I just it's kind of almost the same reasoning with the TSA thing. It's yes, maybe it would end up okay, but it's going to take a long time to talk through this.
They don't know yet either. They don't have the information. I almost think let's educate them, but I also have a alcoholism diagnosis in the past, and I don't know if it's going to fuck up my insurance or what. and a lot of people who have had drug addiction, they're afraid to talk to their doctor about this stuff.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing that I think about this all the time. It's such a great topic you're bringing up, because there is a huge stigma with it, and it's I've seen a lot of different numbers, but let's just say, ballpark 40% to 60% of kratom users are using it in part to help them with coming out of an addiction of some sort. I've seen numbers around that area plenty of times to think that that's about right. Maybe it's a little less, maybe it's a little more, who knows, but so there's going to be
stigma. You said
stigma. My goodness, I'm listening. Yeah, I said it. Okay. There's going to be that stigma attached to it, especially for people who don't know what this other thing is. I guess there's just, my thoughts are, and this goes into what, Kratom Science published, and I love this article. I did an episode on it. The idea of caffeine. I think that to change the narrative about kratom,
Thank you so much, by the way. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, it was an excellent article. It's exactly the sort of way that I think the narrative needs to change. It's not that it needs to be enough a narrative that goes on the offense from the defense, because I don't think that that's going to help. But if there's this thing that most of America uses every morning that is literally giving them a lot of energy, and it's just not cocaine, and you drink it every morning in a tea, but it's a coffee or whatever, why can't someone drink a piping hot cup of tea, of kratom tea, in the morning and get the exact same results? Yeah. And it's it's be ashamed of that. It's really weird to me that people can't understand that. That's the thing that I don't get. Everybody's using coffee. It's as if coffee doesn't exist. Caffeine is scary. Why is that? People get addicted to caffeine all the time, and they get headaches and stuff, and nausea when they stop drinking it. It's okay, people get headaches and nausea when they stop taking kratom. So there you go. Even if that's the worst case scenario for kratom, now kratom and coffee are considered the same, positives and negatives. So what's your problem with kratom?
And there have been literally guys who have died of a teaspoon of caffeine powder. In Australia, there was a kid who died. I'd say he's in his 20s. It's all dudes in their 20s that do this stuff. He took a teaspoon of this heavily concentrated, pure caffeine. He died, and his parents came out. They got it so that I think it's illegal in Australia to sell concentrated caffeine powder. And there's a big learning curve. That's what I said before.
I mean, you think of it I hear so many people either through work or like other people being like, hey, it's 4 in the afternoon, like, oh, how are you doing? They're like, oh, it's a 3-cup of coffee day. It's like, wow, you're drinking 3 cups of coffee because you need 3 cups of coffee to get through your day, and that's fine. I'm not judging you, but it's like, if I take Kratom like 3 times today at 2 grams each, don't look at me weird. It's not like I'm doing anything different than you. We're all trying to get through our day, man.
Yeah. Oh, you talked about like Tylenol and white tie. Like, I would not recommend large amounts. I've read a case report where a guy was on like 3,500 milligrams of Tylenol a day, and then he started taking Kratom and he got a liver injury. He survives, but it's like, I wouldn't recommend that or alcohol, but a little bit I think maybe would be all right. Can you talk about that?
I think I've done, when it comes to alcohol, I think I did 1 or 2 episodes talking about my experience with that. And I'm not a heavy drinker to begin with, but ever since I've started using Kratom, like my, desire for alcohol has gone to 0. Then I find that, I also, when I drink any sort of alcohol, it doesn't really matter what it is for the most part, and I've taken Kratom, it almost like kills the effects of the Kratom. So it's just, I'd rather have the effects of the Kratom than the alcohol. So I don't really combine those hardly ever, and I don't really advocate for it. When it comes to the Tylenol thing, that was an interesting day because I had, I think I had I didn't go crazy the night before, but I had maybe a little too much to drink before bed. And I went to sleep and I woke up the next day and I had a slight headache, like a little bit of a hangover headache. And so I was going to take 2 Tylenol and then go to work. But my past experience with that is that if I have a hangover, even if I a really hearty breakfast or whatever and do everything you're supposed to do and drink plenty of water, if I take a Tylenol or 2, it somewhat makes my headache go away, but for some reason it just makes me feel sluggish even more, and I just don't get through it. My hangover ends at 8 p.m. when the day is over, and it's great, I just wasted all of today. And when I try Kratom for a hangover, it can be helpful, but it can also hurt, and it's kind of up in the air, and I know Kratom can dehydrate you too, so I don't like using Kratom for that reason. So I thought maybe I just did a little white tie and 1 Tylenol and see what that does. And I did a very small amount of white tie. I don't know how much, but it was, maybe a gram. I don't think I did hardly anything. And it was really helpful because the Tylenol took away my headache, but the white tie gave me a teeny bit of a boost to the point where I didn't feel sluggish anymore. And the effects of the hangover just kind of went away. But it was a very, very small, it was the basic smallest amount of Tylenol you can take, and then half a gram of white tie. So I definitely wouldn't advocate for combining high amounts of either one or even medium amounts. But that was just an interesting thing that happened that I shared.
I encourage every Kratom consumer to get their liver tested, and because I've seen, I'm doing an article on these liver bad toxic moments, and a lot of people don't know that they had fatty liver disease, and they started taking Kratom, and it wasn't good. Why do you think Kratom helps you? I mean, we talked about your Tourette's and your tics and that, but is there a deeper anxiety? You might be mourning the loss of your brother. Does it help you in a deeper emotional way or mental health way?
It's a good question. I think that, it spawned out of just, realizing, wow, it took my tics away. And then I used it for a few years, a little bit. And then I literally forgot about it. I, ran out one day and just never popped up in my head to get more. Cause at that point I had been, just kind of not thinking about it that much. And so I didn't take it for a few years. And then I had started taking it in 2016 or so, or whenever that DEA proposed ban was, which is what got me more, lit the fire under me to get more involved with it and to think about it more. But, for the more recent part of my life taking it, I think that the primary reasons have been, I was taking it before my brother passed away, and I was taking it not because of mental health reasons necessarily, but I do have anxiety, social anxiety. And I I don't have problems with motivation. I'm actually very good at getting all my work done, but sometimes I feel like there's a wall in the way. Like I even want to get this thing done, but it's like there's some wall in my brain. It's like, you know, you want to do it, but you're not there. You don't have the oomph to do it. And Kratom, like the second that I take Kratom, within 1 minute, it's like I don't even feel the effects of Kratom yet. And maybe that's placebo, but then I've also like had days where like, you know, I don't know. I just can tell right away that like, okay, I'm going to be able to do this. And then a few minutes later, when I start feeling the Kratom, the first effect that I get from it almost always, green or white, or red, which is interesting, I'll talk about that in a sec, is the first thing I get is, what is it that you want to do? Let's do it. Like clap your hands together. Let's do this thing. And I just think, so that's like been the primary reason. And I use reds for reading because reading is just like a nice relaxing thing at night. But sometimes I have trouble just sitting there and reading through a book, but I love reading books. And if I take just 1 gram, 2 grams of red tie, I will read a book all night long. I love it.
Wow.
But then after my brother passed away, you know, that week I didn't take any Kratom purposefully because I don't think that it messes with how I perceive anything, but I just wanted to deal with the pain as it was and didn't want to have any external factors, you know, like I wasn't drinking, I wasn't smoking marijuana, even though I hardly ever do that, and I didn't take Kratom. But after that, I started taking it kind of like how I used to. I don't find that it's for a mental health thing for me that much, but when I'm having a tough day or I'm just down, and it's not something serious that I just want to cover up, but it's more of just like, I'm just kind of sad today. Green Malay or Green Mang Da, if I take that within a half an hour, 45 minutes, my mood improves tenfold and I just have a better outlook on life. So I definitely use it for that way. You know, the one thing I've found that I've talked about on my show a couple times now, but I feel like I haven't really seen too much elsewhere is Blue Lotus is that's the first time I discovered Kratom. My friend gave me that and he gave me Blue Lotus. And Blue Lotus is this water lily that's from Southeast Asia. It's from Egypt originally. People in Egypt 2,000 years ago would drink Blue Lotus tea or smoke it, and they would just use it as a socialization thing. And it calms you down and it helps you with social anxiety. It kind of reminds me of chamomile, the way it makes me feel. So Blue Lotus and Kratom are like peanut butter and jelly for anyone who doesn't know. And I don't know any of the science behind it, and I certainly am not recommending anyone do anything, but from my own experience, it's a fascinating combination that is like the most symbiotic thing I've ever found, and I don't see much material on it. So I just think that's interesting.
What do you have coming up on the podcast? Do you have any plans, new guests, anything?
Yeah, I actually have a conversation with Joey from Joey Talks on YouTube.
Oh,
That's going to be tomorrow, and that's really exciting. So I think people will enjoy that one.
That's great.
I just was told about him a little while ago, so he's a really interesting guy and really smart, and I think it's a great conversation.
Awesome. That was Jamie, host of Everything Kratom. Link is in the description. So far on the Kratom Science Podcast, we don't advertise and we don't ask for donations, but we do ask for your support. If you could share this on social media, like, subscribe, rate, review, comment. The music is Risey. The song is Memories of Thailand. Kratom Science Podcast, written and produced by me, Brian Gallagher, for KratomScience.com. Take care.